The parking lot was drenched in sunlight, too bright, too indifferent to what was about to unfold. The crowd moved like shadows, some bustling to their cars, others frozen by a scene they didn't want to witness but couldn't ignore. And there he was, an old black man, his back hunched but his pride unwavering, holding onto his grocery bag like it was all he had left. "Hey, you! Step away from that car." The voice cut through the quiet like a blade. It came from a man in uniform, a police officer whose footsteps echoed authority and disdain. The old man looked up, squinting, his face calm but weathered. "What are you talking about? This is my car." The officer didn't blink. His jaw tightened, hand resting casually on the baton clipped to his belt. "I said, step away. I don't know what you're planning, but this isn't gonna end well for you." Murmurs spread through the crowd. A woman clutched her child's hand. A teenager hit record on his phone. Nobody said a word. "Boy, I don't know what kind of game you're playing, but I fought for this country before you were even born, and I'll be damned if you..." Before he could finish, it happened. The officer's boot collided with the old man's side, the sound cracking through the air like a gunshot. The bag of groceries spilled onto the pavement, bread torn, eggs shattered, a carton of milk trickling into the dust. And there he lay, his hand pressed against his ribs, struggling to rise. "You think you're special? Think the rules don't apply to you?" the officer sneered, his voice sharp, his presence towering. The old man didn't respond. Not immediately. His fingers curled against the concrete as if summoning strength from somewhere deep, somewhere the officer couldn't see. Slowly, painfully, he pushed himself to his feet. Blood dripped from his lip. His breathing was heavy. But his eyes burned like fire. "You think this makes you a man? Huh? Kicking an old soldier? I've faced enemies you couldn't dream of, but none as pathetic as you." A ripple ran through the onlookers. The officer's smirk faded. For the first time, doubt flickered behind his gaze, but it was too late. Phones were out. Cameras were rolling. The story was no longer his to control. "You watch yourself, old man. You've got no idea who you're messing with." The veteran smiled, a slow, knowing smile that cut deeper than any words. "Oh, you'll find out. Sooner than you think." At first, the officer brushed it off, shoving his way back to his cruiser like nothing had happened. To him, it was just another interaction. Another moment he'd forget by lunchtime. But the crowd didn't forget. The cameras didn't stop. And by nightfall, his face was everywhere, on phones, televisions, laptops. The caption screamed for justice: "Police officer assaults black veteran in broad daylight." The world erupted. Protests. Outrage. News reporters camped outside the precinct. But it didn't stop there. A quiet truth began to surface, one the officer hadn't seen coming. Because the old man wasn't just any man, he was a name. A decorated hero. A voice people listened to. And while the officer sat alone in his kitchen, phone buzzing relentlessly with messages and threats, he turned on the TV to see something that made his blood run cold. There he was, the same man he'd kicked, now sitting across from a news anchor, calm as ever, speaking directly to the camera. "I was humiliated, but I won't be silent. This isn't just about me. It's about every man who's been treated like they don't belong. And to that officer, if you're listening, justice is coming." The officer's grip tightened around his glass. Suddenly, the tables had turned, and the man he dismissed as nothing was now everything. But this wasn't the end. No, this was only the beginning. Because what happened next would shake an entire community to its core. The secrets uncovered, the power shifted, and the fall from grace that awaited the officer would leave everyone stunned. What happens when the man you thought was powerless becomes the one holding all the cards? And what will it cost you when the world demands justice for the truth you tried to hide? You won't believe how this story ends. Stay with us. The fight for dignity, redemption, and justice has only just begun. At Plough of Twist, we stand firmly against any form of racism or injustice. To every black viewer watching this video, know that you are seen, valued, and supported. Stories like this are told to challenge minds, inspire change, and honor the truth. Racism has no place in our world, and together, we fight for dignity and respect for all. Enjoy the story, and if you like what we do here, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and hit that like button. Let's get started. The parking lot outside Thompson's grocery was the kind of place where lives intertwined, unnoticed and uncelebrated. On any other day, it was unremarkable, a cracked expanse of asphalt filled with beat-up sedans, SUVs, and shopping carts abandoned like forgotten intentions. But today, under a scorching afternoon sun, the air hung heavy with something far different, a tension that most people couldn't name but felt deep in their bones. At the edge of this lot, Walter Gaines moved with a deliberate slowness, as if every step he took carried decades of weight. Walter was 72 years old. He wasn't a big man, not anymore. Time had softened the once hard lines of his frame, shrunk his broad shoulders just enough to show the miles he had walked. His gait was careful, calculated, a rhythm set by knees that had endured too much marching and too many long nights on foreign soil. His clothes, though faded, were clean and pressed, an old habit from his days in uniform. A black cap sat snug on his head, embroidered with the words, Vietnam Veteran, in gold thread. Walter didn't look for attention, but the quiet pride in his posture made people look anyway. Some glanced at him with curiosity, others with indifference. Most barely noticed him at all. But if anyone had stopped to talk to him, to hear his story, they would have met a man whose life had been shaped by courage, loss, and a fierce belief in his own dignity, a dignity that had been earned, not given. Today, Walter had come for groceries. It was supposed to be simple. A loaf of bread. A carton of eggs. A little milk for his morning coffee. Just enough to keep him going. Thompson's was a place he'd shopped at for years, and though the town around it had changed, the grocery store had stayed much the same, small, predictable, familiar. As he stepped outside, paper bag tucked under his arm, he breathed in the dry summer air and squinted against the sun. "Afternoon, Mr. Gaines," called out a woman with a baby on her hip. Walter lifted his chin in greeting, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Afternoon," he replied, his voice low and gravelly, the kind of voice that sounded like it had told 1,000 stories and kept 1,000 more to itself. It was at that moment, when everything seemed just as it always was, that Officer Travis Mitchell entered the scene. Travis was the kind of man who made his presence known before he even opened his mouth. Tall, broad-shouldered, with close-cropped blonde hair and a crisp police uniform that looked freshly ironed, he walked like someone who believed the world owed him respect. His eyes, a cold blue that never seemed to soften, scanned the parking lot with suspicion. There was no real reason for him to be there, just a routine patrol, an excuse to circle through town and remind people that authority was watching. At 32 years old, Travis carried himself like a man who had never doubted his place in the world. He had grown up in this town, in a family where legacy meant everything. His father had been a cop, and his father's father before him. Travis believed in rules. Black and white, right and wrong. There was no room for gray in his mind. He had built his identity on this certainty, and any challenge to it, any challenge to him, felt like a threat. From across the lot, Travis spotted Walter. Maybe it was the way the old man moved, slow, deliberate, that caught his attention. Maybe it was the cap, the one that silently declared the kind of service Travis would never understand. Or maybe it was nothing at all. Maybe he was just looking for something to find fault with. Whatever the reason, Travis's expression darkened as he stepped out of his cruiser and slammed the door shut behind him. Walter heard the boots before he saw the man. That sharp, heavy rhythm against the pavement. It wasn't a sound you could ignore. When he turned, Travis was already striding toward him, hand resting casually on his belt. "Sir!" Travis called, his voice sharp. "Step away from that vehicle." Walter's brow furrowed. He glanced around, unsure who the officer was addressing. "You. I'm talking to you, old man. Step away from the car." Walter blinked, caught between confusion and disbelief. "This is my car, son." The words landed with a weight that Travis didn't like. His jaw tightened. "I don't care what you say. You don't belong here, and I don't want any trouble." Walter let out a slow breath, his gaze steady. "I've got no trouble to give. You're barking up the wrong tree." The crowd began to gather then, drawn by the tension, by the tone in Travis's voice and the stillness of Walter's. A teenager nearby pulled out his phone, the camera angled just enough to capture everything. Travis stepped closer, looming over Walter now. "I'm telling you one more time, move away. Now." Walter shook his head, his voice calm but firm. "I've earned the right to stand here, same as anyone else. Now, you gonna give me a ticket for standing by my own car?" It was the calm that did it, the quiet defiance. Travis's face reddened. His hand moved, almost instinctively, and before anyone could react, his boot struck Walter hard in the ribs. The sound was sharp, sickening. Walter hit the ground with a groan, his grocery bag tumbling from his hand. Bread flattened. Eggs shattered. Milk spread across the pavement in a slow, white pool. The world seemed to hold its breath. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. Then came the murmurs, the gasps, the sharp click of cameras capturing what had just happened. Walter lay still, his chest rising and falling in shallow breaths. Travis stood above him, his face unreadable. Somewhere in the crowd, someone whispered, "Did he just kick him?" And then Walter moved. Slowly. Painfully. He pressed his hands against the concrete, pushing himself upright inch by inch. His lip was split, blood trailing down his chin. He wiped it with the back of his hand, his eyes never leaving Travis's face. When he finally stood, the old man straightened his back, ignoring the sharp ache in his ribs. His voice was soft, but it carried. "You think you've won something here? You think this makes you a man? You don't know a damn thing about me. But you're gonna learn." Travis froze. He hadn't expected the man to get up. He hadn't expected him to say anything at all. The crowd was watching now, watching him. Phones pointed in his direction, recording every detail. Walter turned and began to walk away, his steps slow but steady, leaving behind the shattered groceries, the blood-streaked pavement, and the silence that felt louder than any shout. Travis watched him go, his chest heaving, his pulse racing. He told himself it didn't matter, that it would blow over, like everything else. But he was wrong. What happened that day was just the beginning. And by the time it was over, nothing would ever be the same again. Walter Gaines sat in the dim glow of his living room, the hum of the old ceiling fan barely masking the silence. The ache in his ribs was dull now, though the memory of the officer's boot, its weight, its coldness, refused to leave him. He had replayed the scene in his mind so many times that the edges of it blurred, the look on Officer Travis Mitchell's face, the crowd frozen in place, and those phones, those damn phones. Everyone had watched, but nobody had spoken up. Not yet, at least. His hand hovered over the remote, but the television stayed off. Walter didn't need to see the news to know what was happening. He could feel it, like a slow-building storm that hadn't yet broken. People were talking. The video had spread. The names, Walter Gaines, and Officer Travis Mitchell, were on the lips of strangers, whispered in churches, barbershops, and living rooms across the town. A sharp knock at the door jolted him from his thoughts. He straightened, wincing slightly, and stood. The knocks came again, louder, more insistent this time. "Coming," he barked, his voice sharper than he intended. When he opened the door, the sight of the man on the other side nearly made him close it again. "Walter," said David Moore, his old friend from church, though the word friend hadn't applied in years. David was stocky, with gray around his temples and sharp, assessing eyes. His suit, as always, was immaculate. Walter used to joke that David even cut his grass in a three-piece. "David," Walter muttered, his tone guarded. "What brings you here?" David didn't answer at first. He glanced past Walter into the house before his gaze settled on him again. "Can I come in?" Walter hesitated. There was a history between them, one built on pride, misunderstandings, and years of silence, but he stepped aside. David walked in, taking in the sparse living room with a glance. "You're all over the news, Walter. People are talking. Let 'em talk." Walter closed the door, his movements stiff. David turned to face him. "You know this isn't just about you anymore, don't you? That video, it's out there. It's everywhere. People are mad, Walter. I didn't ask for any of this." "No, but it's here." David stepped closer, his voice softening. "You don't see what's happening out there, do you? The protests, the signs. Half the town's furious at that officer, and the other half's defending him like he's the second coming." Walter met his gaze. "And where do you stand, David?" David's expression hardened. "I stand where I've always stood, on the side of what's right." "And what happened to you?" "That wasn't right. The world knows it." Walter turned away, pacing toward the window. He pulled back the curtain just enough to see the empty street outside. "You think people knowing makes a damn difference? How many times we seen this story before? How many times it end the same? This time's different." David's voice was steady. "Because you're different." Walter let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head. "You sound like one of those reporters." "I'm serious." David's tone sharpened. "People need a leader right now, Walter. Someone who's not afraid to stand up. You think that crowd outside the grocery store didn't notice how you got back up? That you walked away? You didn't give that man the satisfaction of seeing you stay down." Walter's hand tightened on the curtain. He said nothing. David sighed and took a step closer. "There's a town hall meeting tomorrow night. People want answers. They want justice. And they're looking to you." Walter turned slowly, his eyes narrowing. "Justice? I don't even know what that looks like anymore." "Then show them," David said. "Show them what it's supposed to look like." Walter stared at his old friend, his expression unreadable. The room felt heavy, the air thick with words unspoken. "You better go, David," Walter said finally, his voice low. "I appreciate the visit, but I'm not looking to make speeches." David didn't argue. He nodded, his shoulders sinking just slightly as he turned toward the door. "You think about it, Walter," he said, pausing with his hand on the knob. "This town's watching. Whether you like it or not." The door clicked shut behind him, leaving Walter alone once more. The next day, Officer Travis Mitchell was standing at the edge of his front yard, glaring at the lawnmower that refused to start. His uniform was gone, he was on leave now, pending investigation, as the captain had put it. Travis hated those words, hated the way people looked at him when he went to the store, the gym, anywhere. He could feel their stares. Their judgment. Travis. He turned at the sound of his name, his sister, Megan, storming up the driveway, phone in hand. "What now?" Travis muttered, wiping his hands on a rag. Megan's face was flushed, her dark blonde hair frizzing in the heat. She shoved the phone at him. "Did you see this?" Travis glanced at the screen. It was a local news clip, grainy footage of the grocery store parking lot, the moment he kicked Walter replaying in slow motion. His chest tightened, a flash of anger in his eyes. It's everywhere, Megan said. Do you even care? Your face, everyone's talking about you, Travis. You can't just pretend it didn't happen. Travis's jaw clenched. I'm not pretending anything. You attacked an old man, Travis. A veteran. What were you thinking? Travis whipped around, his voice a low growl. You don't know what you're talking about, Megan. You weren't there. I know what I saw. Megan's voice cracked, softer now. And so does everyone else. Travis turned away, fists tight at his sides. I don't have to explain myself to you. Maybe not to me, Megan shot back, but someone's going to make you explain. And when that happens, what are you going to say? Travis didn't answer. He couldn't. That night, Walter sat in the corner of his small kitchen, staring at the cup of tea growing cold in his hands. Outside, faint chants echoed in the distance, protesters marching through the streets, their voices carrying demands for change. The phone rang, breaking the silence. Walter ignored it at first, but it kept ringing. Reluctantly, he rose and answered. Hello. Mr. Gaines, a calm, unfamiliar voice said. This is Lisa Carter, with Channel 5 News. I'm sorry to bother you, but I'd like to talk. People want to hear your side of what happened. Walter's grip on the phone tightened. I don't have a side. With all due respect, sir, you do, Lisa said gently. And the world's waiting for it. Walter hung up without another word. He stared at the phone for a long moment before turning to look out the window. In the distance, the glow of streetlights illuminated groups of people walking, holding signs he couldn't read. The world was watching him now, whether he wanted it to or not. And somewhere in the back of his mind, a thought began to form, an idea that would change everything. The fluorescent lights of the town hall buzzed faintly, humming like an omen in the tense silence of the room. Rows of metal chairs were packed with people, neighbors, co-workers, strangers, all drawn here by the same weight, the same fire sparked days ago in the parking lot of Thompson's grocery. Whispers swirled, hushed but sharp, as heads turned toward the front where a podium waited. A murmur of cameras clicking punctuated the air. The town council sat stiffly behind a long table, expressions unreadable, but their eyes darted to the entrance, as if anticipating something explosive. Walter Gaines sat near the back, a calm shadow in the crowd. His shoulders were still straight, his face unreadable, but anyone looking closely could see the storm behind his eyes, eyes that watched and absorbed everything. He hadn't wanted to come. He wasn't one for spectacles. But now that he was here, seated among a sea of voices crying for answers, his presence felt inevitable. And then, Travis Mitchell walked in. The air thickened like molasses. The crowd fell to a low hush before erupting in scattered whispers. Some people turned their heads to follow him, others glared openly. Travis looked different, less like the swaggering officer from the video and more like a man walking to his own execution. His uniform was gone, replaced by a plain button-up and jeans, but the way he carried himself, chin high, shoulders squared, still screamed authority, even if that authority now hung by a thread. Walter's eyes never left him. He watched Travis cross the room, his steps careful, deliberate, as though the ground might betray him. Finally, the young officer took a seat near the front, arms stiff at his sides. His face was a mask of indifference, but even from where he sat, Walter could see the tension in his jaw. A woman in a gray suit approached the podium and tapped the mic. The noise crackled, snapping the crowd to attention. "Thank you for coming," she began, her voice steady and practiced. "Tonight, we are here to address the incident that occurred last week involving Officer Travis Mitchell and Walter Gaines, a decorated Vietnam veteran." A low rumble ran through the crowd at her words. A man near the back muttered something under his breath, earning a sharp shush from his wife. The woman at the podium pressed on. "The community deserves transparency, and both individuals have been invited to speak. Mr. Gaines, Officer Mitchell, this is your opportunity. Her voice trailed off as she gestured toward the microphone. The room was still. For a moment, it seemed like no one would move, like the silence might swallow them whole. Then Walter stood. He rose slowly, deliberately, as if he was shouldering every pair of eyes that turned toward him. The room stilled even more, if that were possible. He walked to the front, each step echoing across the linoleum floor, until he stood behind the podium. For a moment, he said nothing. The microphone crackled faintly, waiting for his voice. "I've never been much for speeches," Walter said finally, his voice low but strong. "But I reckon there's a time for everything." The crowd listened, rapt. "You've all seen what happened." His gaze swept over the room. "You saw a man put his boot on me, on my pride, like it didn't matter. Like I didn't matter. But let me tell you something." He paused, and when he spoke again, his voice rose just slightly, carrying through the hall. "I've fought for this country. I've bled for it. And I'll be damned if I let anyone, treat me like I don't belong here." The crowd erupted, shouts of agreement, applause, but Walter raised his hand, and the noise subsided. "But this ain't just about me," he continued, his voice steady again. "This is about every man, every woman, who's been kicked down and told to stay there. I got up because I still believe in what's right. I believe in dignity, respect, things we seem to be forgetting these days." He turned his head slightly, his eyes landing on Travis. "And I believe folks can change. If they want to." The silence that followed was deafening. Walter stepped back from the mic and walked back to his seat without another word. The crowd watched him go, their faces a mix of awe, anger, and hope. From his chair near the front, Travis sat frozen. He could feel the weight of every gaze on him. The councilwoman cleared her throat. "Officer Mitchell, would you like to respond?" Travis's stomach turned. He could hear the blood rushing in his ears, feel the sweat prickling the back of his neck. For a moment, he thought of staying silent, letting the weight of it all crush him right there. But then his hands pushed against the chair, and somehow, his legs carried him to the front of the room. The whispers started again. Phones pointed at him, recording his every move. He gripped the edges of the podium, his knuckles white. "I don't have a speech," Travis started, his voice rough, quieter than Walter's but steady enough to be heard. "I don't have any excuses either." The room was so quiet now that a cough would have sounded like a gunshot. "What I did," Travis hesitated, his throat tight. "What I did was wrong." There it was. The words hung in the air like smoke. Walter's gaze locked on him, unflinching. Travis's voice wavered slightly as he continued. "I've spent my whole life thinking I knew what was right. Thinking I knew people, who deserved respect and who didn't. That day, I looked at Mr. Gaines, and I made a judgment that I had no right to make." The crowd stirred, shocked murmurs rippling through it. Travis's jaw tightened, his voice hardening. "It's easy to say I didn't know better. But I did. I just didn't care. And for that, I'm sorry." His eyes lifted then, meeting Walter's directly. "I'm sorry, Mr. Gaines. I'm sorry I disrespected you. I'm sorry I humiliated you. I don't deserve forgiveness, but I needed to say it." The crowd erupted, some in anger, some in surprise, others in quiet agreement. Walter didn't move, his expression unreadable. Travis stood there for a moment longer before he turned and walked back to his seat, shoulders tense, the weight of the room pressing on him. As he sat down, someone shouted, "Sorry doesn't fix it." Another voice countered, "At least he said it. That's more than most." The voices grew louder, overlapping, until the councilwoman banged a gavel against the table. "Order! Order, please!" Walter sat quietly, his gaze never leaving Travis. There was no satisfaction in his expression, no triumph, just something deeper, heavier. Because this wasn't over. Not yet. And Walter Gaines knew that the real reckoning was still to come. The crowd outside the town hall had grown louder, voices rising and falling like a tide that wouldn't settle. Shouts, chants, and murmurs tangled together, creating a wall of noise that seeped through the old building's walls. Inside, the councilwoman banged the gavel again, her voice straining to restore control. Order. I will have order in this room. Slowly, the shouting ebbed into a tense silence, though the undercurrent of tension still buzzed. Travis Mitchell sat rigid in his seat, eyes fixed forward, refusing to look at anyone. His apology hung in the air like smoke, and the weight of it still pressed on his shoulders. Walter Gaines sat a few rows back, his hands folded over his knees. His face gave nothing away, but his mind was a storm. The words Travis had spoken were still echoing in his head, colliding with decades of memories, of battles fought, of losses endured, of the countless times he had been knocked down and told to stay there. Mr. Gaines. The councilwoman's voice broke through the silence. Would you like to respond? The room turned as one, all eyes on Walter. For a long moment, he didn't move. Then, slowly, he stood. Every eye followed him as he made his way back to the podium, his footsteps slow, deliberate. When he reached it, he rested his hands on either side, his fingers curling against the cold metal. The room was so still that it felt like the air had stopped moving. Walter let the silence sit for a moment longer before he finally spoke. You ever hear the sound a bullet makes when it whizzes past your head? His voice was calm, low, but it carried. It's not loud, not like you'd think. It's a whisper, real quiet, but it's a sound you never forget. I heard it the first time when I was 19 years old. Halfway across the world, in a jungle that didn't care if I lived or died. He paused, his gaze sweeping over the room. I fought in a war that folks back home didn't want to talk about. And when I came back, I walked off that plane thinking maybe, just maybe, I'd earned a little peace. A little respect. But that's not what I found. The room seemed to shrink around him, every word pulling them closer. What I found, he continued, was a world that didn't see me as a soldier. It saw me as a threat. It saw me as less. And I carried that weight with me for a long time, every job turned down, every store I got followed around in, every man who looked at me like I didn't belong in my own country. And then, the other day, he paused, his voice catching slightly. The other day, in that parking lot, all those years came rushing back. And it hit me harder than that boot ever could. Travis shifted in his seat, his shoulders tensing as if Walter's words were landing blows he couldn't dodge. He didn't look up. He couldn't. Walter's voice softened. But let me tell you something, Officer Mitchell. The name hung in the air, heavy and deliberate. Travis's head lifted slightly, his jaw clenched. I don't hate you, Walter said simply. I don't even pity you. What I feel for you, he let out a long, steady breath. What I feel is sadness. Because you've been blind your whole life, walking around thinking power comes from the badge on your chest or the weight of your boot. But power, real power, comes from how you treat the people around you. Walter's voice grew stronger, carrying the kind of gravity that only came from truth. You think the world owes you something, boy? It doesn't. The only thing you're owed is what you earn. And respect, you don't take it from someone. You give it, and if you're lucky, it gets given back. Travis's fists curled in his lap, the words cutting deeper than he wanted to admit. He wanted to snap back, to defend himself, to say something, anything, to stop the room from swallowing him whole. But his throat stayed tight, his words stuck somewhere between anger and shame. Walter's gaze stayed on him, unwavering. I stood up that day not because I wanted to make a scene, but because I ain't spent my whole life fighting to let one man take my dignity. Not you. Not anyone. The crowd shifted, murmurs rippling through it again, but Walter ignored them. He turned his attention to the council at the table, his voice steady once more. "This ain't about just me and that man over there," he said, gesturing briefly to Travis without looking at him. "This is about something bigger. I came here tonight to tell you all that this town, our town, needs to do better. We need to stop looking the other way when something ain't right. We need to hold each other accountable, badge or no badge. And we need to start seeing each other for who we really are, human beings." Walter's hand gripped the edges of the podium a little tighter. "I'm tired of being quiet. I'm tired of watching good people get treated like nothing. And I promise you this, if we don't start changing something right now, this moment, we're gonna wake up one day and realize we ain't got a town left worth fighting for." The words landed with a finality that silenced every murmur. Walter let his gaze sweep the room one last time before he stepped back, his presence still lingering as he walked back to his seat. The silence stretched for what felt like forever. Then, from somewhere in the crowd, a single clap rang out. A woman near the back. It was followed by another. And another. Until the room erupted into applause that shook the walls. Travis sat frozen, the sound washing over him, each cheer like a wave crashing down on his chest. He looked at Walter, at the calm, unshaken man sitting quietly at the back, and something inside him cracked. Without thinking, Travis stood, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. The room quieted just enough for his voice to cut through. "Mr. Gaines," he said, his voice rough, shaky. Walter turned his head, meeting his gaze. Travis swallowed hard, his hands trembling slightly at his sides. "I don't deserve your respect. I know that. But you've got mine." The room fell silent again. Travis's words hung there, raw and unpolished, but honest. For the first time in days, Walter allowed himself a small nod. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't an end. But it was a beginning. And as Travis sat back down, the weight on his shoulders felt just a little bit lighter. Outside, the chants of the crowd grew louder, their voices rising into the night air, carrying with them the weight of change, a change that had started with two men, a boot, and a choice to stand. The room felt like it was holding its breath long after the final applause had faded. People whispered in hushed tones as they gathered their coats and shuffled toward the exits, glancing back at Walter Gaines and Officer Travis Mitchell as though expecting more. The tension that had settled in the air didn't dissipate, it lingered like smoke from a fire not quite extinguished. Walter sat in the same chair, his hands resting steady on his knees, his face still and unreadable. He didn't flinch as council members began packing up their notes and murmuring among themselves. It wasn't victory he felt, no, victory wasn't the right word. What had unfolded in that room had been necessary, but it was far from over. A ripple in the water, not the wave itself. Travis remained seated near the front, staring blankly at the ground, shoulders hunched. The image of him standing at the podium, raw, exposed, was still fresh in Walter's mind. The man had stumbled, unsure of his words, yet the weight of his admission had been unmistakable. "Respect. You've got mine." Walter didn't know if he believed the words yet, but he'd heard something in Travis's voice that couldn't be ignored, sincerity, and regret. A deep voice cut through Walter's thoughts. Hell of a speech back there. Walter looked up. It was David Moore again, his sharp gaze fixed on him as he stepped closer. The crowd had thinned, leaving the two men amid a room now littered with empty chairs and discarded papers. "Didn't expect you to get up there and put that young man in his place so cleanly," David added, folding his arms. "I didn't put anyone anywhere," Walter replied, his voice low. "I just told the truth." David let out a dry chuckle. "That might be, but truth's got consequences, Walter. That officer, Travis, he's already a pariah out there. Saw his face plastered all over the news on my way in. You think people are gonna let this die down anytime soon?" Walter's gaze darkened slightly. "That's not up to me, David. He made his choices. Maybe." David's tone softened, but there was a warning there. But you know as well as I do, this town eats its own. People don't care about redemption. They care about blood. And that young man's got a target on his back now. Walter turned toward him slowly, meeting his gaze. What are you getting at, David? David shifted, clearly uncomfortable for a moment. I'm just saying, be careful where this goes, Walter. You stood up there and gave him something to rally behind, but the line between justice and revenge? It's thin. Walter didn't answer. He didn't need to. He knew exactly what David meant. The people who had cheered for him in that room, who'd shouted for justice in the streets, weren't just looking for answers. Some of them wanted payback. And payback had a way of going too far. By the time Walter stepped outside, the evening had deepened into a cool, unsettling quiet. The protesters were still there, though fewer now, their voices quieter as they stood in small clusters beneath the streetlights. Most of the signs had been lowered, though one or two remained defiantly raised in the air, justice for Walter Gaines. As he passed, some people clapped him on the shoulder, murmuring words of encouragement. You're a strong man, Mr. Gaines. Thank you for standing up. We're with you all the way. Walter nodded politely, acknowledging each one, but he didn't linger. He felt their energy, their hope, but also their anger, and it sat heavy on his shoulders. Then he saw him. Across the street, standing near his car with his back pressed against the door, was Travis Mitchell. His eyes scanned the small crowd warily, his face pale under the glow of the streetlight. It was clear he didn't want to be seen, yet he was too exposed to hide. Walter stopped, his footsteps slow and deliberate as he made his way across the street. He could feel the eyes on him, the murmurs rising again as people noticed what was happening. Travis looked up just as Walter reached him, his shoulders tensing like he was bracing for a hit. Walter said nothing at first, just stood there, his expression steady and unreadable. Finally, he broke the silence. Why are you still here? Travis swallowed hard, his voice low. I didn't think it was right to leave. Not yet. Not right to leave. Walter echoed, his brow furrowing. And what's right, exactly, in your mind? Travis looked down, his hands fidgeting at his sides. I don't know. Not anymore. Walter's gaze didn't waver. You don't know, huh? Maybe that's the first true thing you've said all day. Travis flinched, his eyes snapping up. I messed up, okay? I know I did. I can't take it back, but I didn't mean, his voice trailed off, the words failing him. You didn't mean what? Walter pushed, his voice low but sharp. Didn't mean to kick me when I was down. Didn't mean for the whole damn world to see what kind of man you are. Travis's jaw tightened, and for a moment, Walter thought he might snap back. But instead, the young man's shoulders sagged. You're right, Travis admitted softly. I deserve this. Every bit of it. Walter stared at him, the weight of those words hanging in the air between them. He didn't know if he believed Travis, not yet, but there was something in the young man's face, something that looked an awful lot like shame. Go home, son, Walter said finally, his voice quieter now. This isn't the place for you tonight. Travis hesitated. And tomorrow? Walter held his gaze. Tomorrow, you figure out what kind of man you want to be. And you start living like it. Travis nodded slowly, a flicker of something, gratitude, maybe, crossing his face. Without another word, he climbed into his car and drove off, the engine's low rumble fading into the night. Walter turned back toward the crowd, who had watched the whole exchange in silence. He could feel their questions, their unease, but he didn't give them any answers. Not yet. He walked home that night, the cool air brushing against his skin, his mind churning. David's words echoed in his ears, unshakable. The line between justice and revenge is thin. Walter had stood up because he couldn't bear to stay down. He had spoken because the truth needed to be heard. But now that the truth was out, it had a life of its own, and he didn't know where it would go next. And as he unlocked the door to his quiet, empty house, Walter couldn't shake the feeling that the storm was far from over. The street was dark, save for the pale glow of streetlights casting long shadows across cracked pavement. Walter Gaines sat on his porch, a chipped wooden rocker creaking beneath him. His breath came slow, steady, the cool night air easing the lingering tightness in his ribs. He didn't like thinking about that day, about the boot, the weight of it, the sound of groceries scattering like brittle bones on concrete, but the image haunted him. It lingered in flashes when he closed his eyes. From inside, the faint hum of his old radio played a tune so soft it barely reached the porch. He found comfort in it, as if it grounded him, tethering him to something real. He was almost ready to call it a night when he heard it, a faint noise near the edge of his yard. Walter stilled, his hand pausing mid-rock. The sound came again, footsteps, hesitant but deliberate. He leaned forward, peering into the darkness. A figure approached, emerging into the light with a kind of quiet reluctance. It was Travis Mitchell. Walter didn't move, didn't speak. He watched as the young man hesitated at the bottom of the steps, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. He looked smaller without his uniform, plain clothes, shoulders slumped, as though the weight of the world had settled on him and refused to budge. Walter's voice broke the silence. "You lost." Travis's head lifted slightly, and for a moment, his face flickered with something, fear, maybe, or shame. "No, sir," he said softly. "I'm right where I need to be." Walter didn't respond. He leaned back into his chair, the rocker creaking again. "Didn't expect to see you here," Walter added, his voice calm but firm. "Especially this late." Travis shifted on his feet, his gaze darting around like he didn't know where to look. I wasn't sure I'd come. Didn't know if I should. And yet here you are," Walter said simply. Silence settled between them. The night seemed to hold its breath, waiting for what would happen next. Finally, Travis took a step closer. "Can I sit?" Walter raised an eyebrow, more out of surprise than anything else. He gestured to an old chair beside him, a second rocker that hadn't been used in years. "Suit yourself." Travis climbed the steps slowly, like he was approaching a battlefield. When he sat, the chair groaned under his weight. He stared at his hands, his fingers fidgeting as though searching for something to hold on to. For a long time, neither man spoke. The faint hum of the radio filled the quiet, mingling with the chirp of crickets. Then, Travis broke the silence. "I don't know how to start," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Walter turned his head, looking at him carefully. "Start where you need to." Travis inhaled deeply, his hands gripping his knees. "I keep replaying that day. That moment. Over and over. Like some sick movie that won't stop. And every time I see it, I ask myself, what was I thinking? Why'd I do it?" Walter didn't answer. He let Travis keep talking. "And the truth is, I don't know," Travis continued, his voice tightening. "I saw you standing there, and all I could see was a threat. You hadn't done anything, and still I made you the enemy. Like I'd already decided who you were without even knowing your name." Walter's voice came soft, steady. "And what am I, in your mind?" Travis looked up at him then, meeting his gaze for the first time. His expression was raw, eyes red-rimmed, mouth tight, the facade of control completely shattered. "I don't know anymore," he admitted. "Not after that day. Not after hearing you speak." Walter nodded slowly, his face unreadable. "What you did," he paused, choosing his words carefully, "what you did wasn't about me, son. It was about you. Whatever it was you thought you were fightin', it wasn't me standin' there in that parking lot." Travis blinked, confusion flashing across his face. "What do you mean?" Walter let out a long breath, staring out into the darkened street. I've been alive long enough to know that hatred doesn't start with the man in front of you. It starts somewhere deeper, somewhere you don't want to look. A man doesn't put his boot on someone unless he's fighting something inside himself. Travis looked away, shame flooding his face. He clenched his jaw, swallowing hard. "You're right," he said quietly. "I've been fighting something my whole life. I just never knew what to call it." Walter turned toward him again, his voice low but insistent. "Then you best figure it out. 'Cause carrying that kind of weight will break a man clean in two." The words hit Travis like a hammer, and he slumped slightly, his shoulders sagging under the truth of them. "I want to be better," he said suddenly, his voice breaking. "I swear to God, I do. But how do I make this right? How do I fix something like this?" Walter stared at him for a long moment, his face unreadable. "You don't fix something like this with words, son. You fix it with what you do next." Travis nodded, but the motion was weak, uncertain. "I don't even know where to start." Walter's gaze softened just slightly. "You start by listening. You start by learning. And you start by understanding that respect ain't something you take, it's something you earn. You want to make this right? Then you earn it, every damn day." Travis blinked hard, as though trying to hold back tears. He looked down at his hands again, his voice barely audible. "I don't deserve your kindness." Walter's lips twitched, almost into a smile. "Ain't about what you deserve. It's about what kind of man you decide to be." Silence fell between them again, but this time it felt different. It wasn't heavy or tense. It was still, like the first moments of calm after a storm. Finally, Travis stood, his movements slow and deliberate. He turned to face Walter, his voice soft. "Thank you. For listening. For not shutting the door on me." Walter nodded, but his gaze stayed steady. "Don't thank me yet. You've got a long way to go." Travis gave a small, almost imperceptible nod before stepping off the porch and disappearing into the dark. Walter watched him go, his figure fading into shadow until the street was empty again. He leaned back in his chair, letting the rocker creak beneath him. The night felt quieter now, as if the earth itself had exhaled. Walter didn't know what tomorrow would bring, for Travis, for the town, or for himself, but for the first time in days, the weight on his chest felt just a little bit lighter. Because this wasn't about one man. It never had been. And deep down, Walter knew that the real fight, the one that mattered, was just beginning. The sun was just beginning to rise, spilling soft streaks of gold over the quiet town. Walter Gaines stood at the window of his small kitchen, a steaming cup of coffee cradled in his hand. The world outside seemed still, almost peaceful, but Walter knew better than to believe it would stay that way. The events of the past few days had stirred something in the town that couldn't be ignored, a reckoning, slow but certain. And while Walter hadn't asked for any of it, he felt its weight pressing against his shoulders. A soft knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts. Walter turned, frowning slightly, and made his way to the front of the house. When he opened the door, he wasn't surprised to see David Moore standing there, a newspaper tucked under one arm and a weary smile on his face. "Morning, Walter," David said, lifting the newspaper slightly. "You might want to take a look at this." Walter raised an eyebrow but stepped aside to let him in. David moved to the kitchen table and spread the paper out across it. Bold headlines blared from the front page: "Officer Mitchell resigns amid growing pressure, community applauds Gaines' call for change." Walter pulled out a chair and sank into it, his gaze lingering on the words. He hadn't expected this, not entirely. Travis Mitchell had been holding on tight to his badge, his authority, his place. Seeing that he'd let it go left Walter with a strange mixture of satisfaction and something else he couldn't quite name. David sat across from him, his voice softer now. "He quit last night. Issued a statement. Said he was stepping down to take responsibility and become a better man. The town's buzzing about it. Walter took a sip of his coffee, letting the words settle. Good for him. You really think that? David asked, his tone edged with skepticism. Walter looked up, his expression calm but firm. I do. A man's gotta know when it's time to stop fightin' and start fixin' himself. If he's got the guts to do that, then maybe there's hope for him yet. David leaned back in his chair, studying Walter for a moment. What about you, then? What's next for Walter Gaines? Walter's lips twitched into a faint smile as he turned his gaze back to the window. Same thing as always, David. I get up, I keep moving, and I let the world figure itself out. That's enough for me. David chuckled under his breath, shaking his head. You're a stubborn old man, Walter. Some things never change. Across town, Travis Mitchell sat on the edge of his bed, staring down at the resignation letter still clutched in his hands. The room around him was sparse now, half-empty boxes scattered on the floor, the walls bare where photos and certificates had once hung. His uniform lay draped across the back of a chair, neatly folded but no longer his to wear. His phone buzzed from the nightstand, and for a moment, Travis considered ignoring it. But something told him to check, so he reached for it. A text blinked on the screen. It was from Megan, his sister. You did the right thing. I'm proud of you. Travis let out a shaky breath, his eyes lingering on the message. For the first time in days, his chest felt a little less tight. He knew he couldn't undo what he'd done, couldn't erase the moment that had sparked everything. But maybe, just maybe, he could start again. A new beginning. A better one. He stood, grabbed the uniform from the chair, and carefully placed it in the box with the rest of his things. Before leaving the room, he glanced once more at the empty walls, as if saying goodbye to the man he had been. Days turned into weeks, and slowly, the town began to change. The protests quieted, replaced by conversations, real ones. People met in churches, libraries, and community centers, talking about the kind of place they wanted to build together. Walter watched it all unfold from a distance, neither leading the charge nor stepping away. He didn't need recognition, he just needed to see that something was shifting. One afternoon, as he sat on his porch, a car pulled up to the curb. The door opened, and Travis stepped out, holding a manila folder in his hand. Walter squinted, rocking slowly as Travis walked up the steps. Didn't expect to see you again, Walter said, his tone even. Travis nodded, his face solemn. I know. I won't take up much of your time. Walter gestured to the second rocker beside him. Sit. Travis hesitated but complied, setting the folder on his lap. I've been doing a lot of thinking. A lot of learning, he started, his voice careful. And I wanted to show you something. Walter waited as Travis opened the folder, pulling out a piece of paper. He held it out, and Walter took it with a frown. The paper was a printed proposal, community outreach program, police training for respect and accountability. I've been working on this, Travis explained. A program to retrain officers, start with us learning about the communities we serve. Understanding them, respecting them. I'm not asking for your approval, but I wanted you to know. Walter's eyes scanned the paper, the words blurring slightly. When he looked up, there was no anger on his face, only curiosity. And you think this'll fix things? Travis shook his head. No. But it's a start. Walter stared at him for a long moment before nodding. It is. A silence settled between them, heavy but not uncomfortable. Travis stood after a while, brushing off his jeans. I'll leave you be now. As he turned to leave, Walter's voice stopped him. Travis. Travis turned, his expression uncertain. Walter nodded, just once. Keep walking that path. Don't stray. Travis's lips curled into the faintest hint of a smile. I won't. Life moved forward, as it always did. Walter Gaines remained a quiet fixture in the town, a man who had stood when others might have stayed down. People came to him for advice, for strength, for wisdom that could only come from a life fully lived. Travis Mitchell became part of the background, no longer a figure of hate but a man who worked, slowly, to rebuild his life. His name wasn't celebrated, but he was no longer a stain on the town's conscience. And for Walter, that was enough. Stories like this aren't just about what happens in one moment, they're about what happens after. When the dust settles, when the shouting stops, we're left with a choice. Who are we going to be? What kind of world are we going to leave behind? Walter Gaines made a choice to stand tall, to reclaim his dignity, not just for himself but for those who came before him, and for those who would come after. Travis Mitchell had to face the truth of his actions, a truth that forced him to either stay broken or start rebuilding. The line between justice and revenge is thin, but when justice prevails, it can lead to something greater, change. Now, I want to hear from you. What would you have done if you were in Walter's shoes? Would you have forgiven Travis? Or would you have walked away? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to Tales of Twist for more narratives that challenge, inspire, and surprise. See you in the next one.